morning, everyone, and welcome to FSMA Fridays, or as we call it. Thank God it's FSMA Fridays Day. My name is Jill Bender with Safety Chain Software. Looks like we have a fairly large crowd with us. I'm not surprised. 2016, I think, will be a banner year for FSMA for sure. And I'm delighted to get things moving here. So with this, just to let you know, we will be going over a quick update, and then our focus for today's discussion will be some of the challenges that the industry is facing with implementing FSMA, and then certainly our team, our tag team, the Acheson Group team, will give us some guidance around some of the challenges being faced. So before we begin, as always, just a quick reminder, we do always send out the recording link on Monday. Any questions that you want to submit for today's session, they do have to be put in online. So if you've called in only, sorry, it'll just be a listen in only, but for those online, you can put in questions. For your privacy, as always, you'll only see the panelists, but as I mentioned, I'm delighted. It's quite the crowd today. And lastly, I should always mention, WebEx does enable you to listen to this via your computer speakers, but if it's not quite clear, if it's getting choppy, I would just recommend using the call-in number, and that is also available within the WebEx platform. So with that, let's go ahead and begin. I'm delighted to have two members with the Acheson Group on with us. Good morning to both Peyman and to Christopher.
Good morning, Jill.
Good morning, Jill.
Oh, wonderful. We're delighted to have you. The Acheson Group, I just admired the team and the wealth and depth and breadth of the experience that the team brings. And both Peyman, Fatemi, and Christopher Snabes are just are going to add so much value to today's discussion. So thank you for joining us. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Peyman, why don't we start with you? Why don't you give us what's the latest with FSMA?
Sure, Jill. Thank you, and good Friday to everybody. Hope you're doing well, and if you're up in the northeast and staying out of the cold. Not a lot of updates here on the FSMA side. We're still waiting for some of the guidance documents that are expected to be published as well, but there's no word on the timing and the content, so waiting on those. And not a lot more to add in terms of the final two rules that are expected to be published. The sanitary transport's going to be published at the end of March 31st, and at the end of May will be the food defense. The training systems for the PC rules are underway, and looks like there's quite a bit of audience, and as expected, a lot of interest. So there's a bit of a backlog in terms of getting people signed up, and there seems to be quite strict about the criteria that is being applied to who is accepted. So that's certainly been happening, and it's applied and it's presented across the country and with quite a bit of interest.
Okay, great, thank you. So a bit going on beyond just snow on the Capitol. I don't know if everyone saw, I wish there was a picture on here of the people sledding down the hill of the steps. I thought that was pretty amazing. So let's go ahead and dive into some of our questions. And again, the topic for today is really surrounding some of the challenges that the industry is facing with FSMA implementation and a bit of guidance around some topics. So we will go ahead and get started. And Christopher, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to you. Could you share some guidance on understanding HARPC and some of the challenges and guidance around that?
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Let's start off with what is a HARPC, which is a hazard analysis and risk-based preventive control, commonly referred to as a preventive control. Many companies, when they first see that, they say to themselves, where do I begin? How do I implement it? The easiest thing to do is to begin with your HACCP plan and your hazard analysis. Look at your HACCP flow chart. Anything on your HACCP flow chart that you consider a critical control point, or CCP, in general, will now become a preventive control. So right away, you are already on your way to implementing what is a preventive control. Other things that could be a preventive control could be any of your prerequisite programs, such as your sanitation programs or your environmental monitoring programs. A lot of companies when they are implementing their preventive controls, will look at how they manufacture their food and look at all the steps, and they have to realize that there is now additional hazards that they might not have considered in the past as a hazard. So for example, the best way to understand is to take a manufactured product that's a ready-to-eat food, for example. Many instances, after the food is produced and before that food is packaged, it's exposed to the environment. And many times that food, as it's exposed, you have to say to yourself, is there anything that could be entering that food before it's packaged? If so, how do I control it? Well, in some instances, you could control it by putting a cover over that food so it's not exposed to the environment, but in other instances, that's not possible. So you can look at your whole environment and say, well, am I controlling for that potential contamination by implementing a good environmental program? And if so, that environmental program can now be one of your preventive controls along with sanitation. And how would you verify that? Well, you could verify that that's being implemented properly by doing final product testing. So it's more of a holistic approach as to how you look at implementing your preventive controls. And that's how we see quite a few companies in industry are now looking at it. They're looking at the whole process, not just the current critical control points, but any other points along the line that may impact the food.
Great, and thank you. And I think what's so interesting, and it's always good to hear, is you don't have to start over, right? That it's start with what you already have in place and continue to grow and refine from there. So good info. Let me go ahead and take us to the next topic that we're talking about. And actually, I believe we might have skipped one. Let me look. I had a note regarding Foreign Supplier Verification, FSBP program. So if you wanted to sort of address that, that would be great as well.
Okay, I can also discuss that. So the Foreign Supplier Verification program is for importers of food. And the final rule requires importers have to perform certain risk-based activities to verify that food imported to the U.S. has been produced in a manner that meets applicable U.S. safety standards. Now, the final rule gives flexibility in meeting some of these requirements. For example, importers can meet the key Foreign Supplier Verification Program obligations by relying on analysis, evaluations, and activities performed by other entities, and in certain circumstances, as long as those importers review and assess corresponding documentation. The FDA is also going to provide guidance on this rule. There are several key requirements. First of all, you have to determine whether or not you're subject to the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. In many instances, there are many exceptions in which you are not. For example, if you are following juice and seafood HACCP, then you're exempt. Many times if you're importing the food and that food is then manufactured and processed by you and you're controlling for those risks and those hazards, then you're not subject to the rules. So you have to determine just exactly who is applicable to it. And there's a great flow chart that the FDA put out that says, am I subject to the Foreign Supplier Verification Program? And it gives many steps as to whether or not you are subject to it. All importers have to follow written procedures as always. What else do we need to know? Excuse me. The importer has to make sure that they perform the hazard analysis. They have to evaluate the food risk and the supplier performance, and they have to perform supplier verification programs. Many instances, the way to do the supplier verification is through audits and third-party audits. You can use those third-party audits to establish whether or not the FSVP is qualified.
Great. Anything else more to add, or I'll skip back to where I probably should have started, but thank you for that information.
Sure. I'm sure Rolando has some aspect of the supplier control program, how that also fits into it.
Yes, and typically that would have been the right order, and I skipped ahead in my my coffee-induced haste here. Peyman, so coming back to you, just in regards to also supply chain controls and adding on what should have been the first part of that, look forward to hearing your thoughts on this.
Sure, thank you, Jill. And I'd like to just to add that, you know, what we're doing in this discussion is for many of the previous FSMA Fridays, the topic's been somewhat specific around whether it was supply chain control, environmental monitoring, provisions of the preventative controls rules. But in this case, now that the industry is beginning to implement these rules and talking about what are the challenges that they're facing and what are we seeing out there. And so it's really a timely topic because now it's becoming reality for a lot of folks, and as Chris said, they're looking at their supply chain program, whether it's foreign supplier program or a domestic program, and trying to assess where is the risk coming from? What is the risk and where is it coming from and who's controlling it? Is the supplier that are supplying the ingredients or components of your food controlling the risk, or are you controlling the risk? And who is within your supplier program? So the questions that companies are faced with is the visibility to the entire supply chain. If they're purchasing it from a distribution center, then some of the challenges that they're facing with is visibility to the suppliers of their suppliers. So going back several tiers, what we're seeing is that is becoming a bit of a challenge for them. And so visibility becomes an issue, and it really needs to be as transparent as possible so that you know who is and where is that risk being controlled. And how to best evaluate the suppliers or the supply, or maybe a combination of both. Is your supplier being responsive to you? A lot of times you come up with a questionnaire, and those questionnaires could be fairly simple in some cases and quite lengthy in others, depending on the complexity of your program and the depth to which you'd like to learn more about it. And so getting the suppliers to respond back to that, we've seen has been quite a bit of a challenge. And so if they're not responsive, that obviously increases the risk because you're not visible and privy to a lot of what's going on and how they're controlling that risk. Identifying backup suppliers or having qualified backup suppliers is another issue. In many cases, these suppliers have a long-standing relationship with the company, but maybe the company hasn't quite asked all the questions pertaining to how the supplier is controlling this risk. Maybe they're not quite understanding the validation of the methods or the kill steps, let's say, within their supplier's supply chain, and getting that information sometimes is proven to be a difficult thing. A lot of times they rely on a certificate of analysis, and that is fine as long as you understand what risk they're trying to control. Are they looking at the right set of criteria, specifications, microbiological levels? How is that test being conducted? What type of sampling program? What method? What laboratory is doing the work? And are they accredited for the specific matrices? So a lot of questions there for them to understand in terms of the data that's coming in and the quality of that information. A lot of times the companies have had, as I mentioned, long-standing with their suppliers, so they become somewhat complacent. Well, we've been doing this for a long time, and we haven't had any issues. And that may be true, but you still need to understand how that company is managing the risk or how you will manage the risk. And communication sometimes tends to be somewhat difficult. It needs to be two ways. It needs to be frequent, and so that they know, your suppliers know how and where they stand and rank within your sort of risk ranking, if you have that program in place, supply chain program. So lots of various challenges that they're running into. For some companies, a lot of these programs have already existed, and so it's not a very difficult list, and so they're just asking, how can we be best in class? And for others, they're looking at this from a whole new light and from a whole new lens, and it's becoming a lot more challenging. And so we're kind of seeing it across the spectrum in terms of the challenges that those companies are facing and the industry is facing as a whole.
No, that seems to make sense. There was a comment, and I just want to throw this in because I think it's very applicable to what you were just talking about. Similar to when you're in the supply, when you're going through your supply chain and those you interact with, the question often comes of, or mandated, right, about GFSI certification. And I think that the comment was really referenced to pretty much asking the same question as far as FSMA readiness, or have they done their analysis and updated their own programs to meet FSMA compliance components. So I thought that was interesting. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. I think, and I'll let Chris weigh in on that as well, is if you have a GFSI recognized scheme and a program, and a lot of those, like SQF, do have a requirement for understanding the risk and conducting a supply chain assessment. And so those programs could be quite a ways into meeting the requirements for conducting supply chain management and risk management. So if you have that program in place, you may not be far off from being FSMA compliant.
Anything you want to add up to that? Yeah.
Yes, I agree with Peyman. It's true. Many of the GFSI schemes bring companies very, very close to implementing many or most of the new FSMA rules. So if you're GFSI certified in one of the umbrella schemes, then you're well on your way. You're more than 85% of the way there.
So then conversely, with the folks in your supply chain, if they're GFSI, then they're well on their way, which goes back to addressing the concerns, correct?
Correct.
So, okay, good. Now I appreciate that comment coming in. Thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next topic. We've already covered FSVP, so we'll move on to finished product testing. And I believe, Peyman, you were going to address this as well, some of the challenges and guidance around that.
Sure. And I think that finished product testing, or really testing in general, fits nicely, and Chris alluded to that, within a hazard analysis and risk-based preventative control approach for FSMA. Finished product testing is really intended as a verification step to make sure that the preventative controls that you've implemented, where there used to be your CCPs and your preventative controls, are indeed effective. And it's appropriate, needs to be appropriate to the food, the risk that you're trying to control, and the specific process. It's not a requirement by looking at the strict definition of the rule that finished product testing is not a requirement, but it can be a component of as a verification of preventative controls. And it's a very useful tool. Obviously, there's a lot of questions in terms of how much to test, what to test, for how often to test, and these are all the questions that are being asked. And as a pertinent ones, it's appropriate to the risk. If there's a low water activity food, perhaps the salmonella. The question is how many tests do you do, at what frequency, what method are you going to use, what laboratory, what are the validations and accreditations around the test methods, and at what cost. And these are all the challenges and the questions that the industry is asking. And at the end of it, when you do the test, what are you going to do with that information? That's the sort of the biggest piece is, if you do indeed find a organism that potentially could be an adulterant, how much control do you have within the supply chain to make sure that product doesn't enter commerce? And how are you managing that data? And a lot of that is understanding your process first, understanding what is normal, what are normal process conditions based on the testing, not just for pathogens, but also for indicator organisms, and to understand what is when a product is within specifications, it's produced within all the parameters of your process, what are normal background flora that may be expected to be part of that product, and what is out of normal. So it requires managing and trending that data to get a historical perspective of what influences that information as well. Is this regional? Is it seasonal? Is it dependent on climate change, weather? And a lot of that could influence the quality and potentially safety of the product as well. So a lot of questions around finished product testing. It's a very useful verification tool for ensuring that the preventative controls, again, are effective, but it's driven and it's causing a little bit of headache for companies that haven't fully thought it through in terms of what it means. Some are questioning, should we do the testing in-house versus sending it out to a third-party lab? So these are all lots of things to consider for companies to implement finished product testing. What kind of specs? And at the very end of it, documentation of the test results, your corrective actions if required, and having that information available upon request. So it is, for some companies, it's not a difficult lift at all. They have been doing this, they have a lot of these programs in place, and so maybe just business as usual. For others, it will require some thoughts and logistics and resource allocation and management. So again, it's the implication and challenges are kind of across the board, but lots to consider for them.
Okay, great, thank you. And we're going to go ahead and do this. That was our last pre-submitted question for today. I am going to bring us back into the normal screen, and I see that some questions have already started to get queued up for people who are interested in asking questions. We're going to be able to get to a few today, and then we will save the others, and we're excited next month to announce a launch of a few other things around FSMA Fridays, which will also include getting to more of your questions. So for those that do have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A tab, and I will, again, just serve in the interest of time and making sure we all get out of here at the bottom of the hour. I'm just going to go through a couple other quick slides for you. I think the whole topic for today was interesting in the respect that 2016 is here. It's sort of pedal to the metal, if you will, as far as now having to be in compliance, 2 more final rules, and just sort of really understanding what are the gaps or how does rules specifically apply to you, as Peyman, what you were just talking about, maybe finished product testing, you have some questions about that. So I always like to just do a call out to the TAG team, because that's what they do, right? So they're the consulting. We're not going to do a big ad here, but, for those that are looking for that next step of information specific to the company, there's a lot of ways that TAG can help you in understanding that, understanding what you need to achieve. And then, of course, I've got to say for Safety Chain as well, our automation platform and mobile apps absolutely help with FSMA readiness, from automation of vendor program to your supply chain controls, HARPC, and making sure it's all being captured appropriately and for audit readiness and trending for improvement. So with that, let's go ahead and get to some of our questions. And what I'll do today is we just have a few. First one is asking, is finished product testing is a verification or a validation step of the preventive controls? And I don't know, Peyman, if you want to take that since you were talking through that?
Sure. It's really a verification step when it's done on a routine basis, that all the the validation essentially happens early on, that whether it's through studies, challenge studies, to validate that the system is working, that you're able to achieve the targeted microbial reduction, are you able to maintain the process within prescribed parameters, and then you do monitoring and verifying that those preventative control parameters that you set in are effective. So it's really a verification when it's done from the context of routine testing and has release criteria perhaps for the product itself. So
okay, great. The short answer, right?
Yeah, that is really a short answer. There's a lot more obviously consideration, but Chris, do you want to add anything to it?
No, I thought you answered that perfectly.
Yeah, no, and we'll get to a few more questions here. So the high-level short answers are perfect in this scenario. I do have one question. How will supply chain controls work for pilot plants? I think this one's interesting, something we haven't seen before on FSMA Fridays, question-wise. So the question is, we see different suppliers daily. This is in a scenario of pilot plants. Is there a way for us to make the customer for that day responsible for this? And this is around supply chain controls. That might be the stumper question of the day.
Pilot, Chris, do you want to take a stab at this, and maybe I'll chime in?
I would, if the supplier is not controlling for the known risk, they can inform that pilot plant that they're supplying them with an item. Say it has known to be hazardous for salmonella. The pilot plant would have to acknowledge that, document that, and document to that supplier that we accept it, and we will control for that risk.
Okay. Seems fairly straightforward there, or maybe not, a little bit of gray shades on some of the stuff, but thank you. I'm going to jump on to another question. Go ahead.
Sorry, we can certainly follow up on that with the submitted questions, because there may be some provisions around research and development activities that may be subject to some modified requirements, perhaps. So that's something we can certainly follow up with.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, right? We haven't really talked about that in FSMA Friday, so I think that was a good question, and thank you for that submission. I'm going to go ahead and pull out one more here, and then, again, we'll make sure we've captured these questions and get to some of these in our new expanded format for FSMA Fridays in February. Question is, are you seeing much activity from specific food industry groups, such as, they give a few things, bakery, spices, produce, putting together programs or educational aids for their member companies to address these topics? So again, the expansion of training and guidance beyond vertical-wise. Any comments on that?
I'll take that. Yeah, we are actually, and they are reaching out to us and other groups to help with that. There is specific industry group level activities to educate their members on specific provisions and the rules that apply to them, and what are some of the best practices within that industry to communicate out. And we were involved sometimes in the development of that, sort of a guidance document or a review of it, and we've, in other cases, we're presenting to them on where we think the rule best applies to them. So definitely, there are a number of industry groups that are looking at it from specific applications to their specific needs.
Yeah, we belong or are part of a lot of the associations, and we're starting to see quite a bit of conferences and workshops around that as well, it seems. I'm going to add one last question, and I think it's just as a follow-up to this. I think it's a good follow-up, is just any thoughts on when we can expect the FDA guidance documents to begin to start coming out?
I don't, and I, in fact, had that chat with David early on, is have you heard anything in terms of date and timeline and even content? And the answer is unfortunately no, we don't. I'd expect, I think one of the it has to be this year because it has to be, I think, within a year of implementation of the rule. But within 2016, unfortunately, we don't. But I don't think we're that far from it, at least for the first flag rule.
Right, and well, maybe that'll be a good update question and some news on that with our February session. So with that, there's just a couple other quick things I'm going to wrap up here. And again, if we didn't get your question, we always capture those. Along with today's topic, it's something that I think is especially timely and really wanting to hear from you all, our audience here, is really, what are you doing for FSMA readiness? What are your challenges and your strategies to identify the gaps, to implement or update your programs and so forth. Along that regard, we are launching a FSMA readiness survey sponsored by both the Acheson Group and Safety Chain. It will be a part of your follow-up link to FSMA Fridays on Monday with the recording, and we just invite you to participate. It's about 10 to 12 questions. It'll take you maybe 5 minutes or so, but it's an opportunity to share where you all are at as far as the company goes, but also just get a pulse on where your peers are at as well. So we think there'll be some interesting data that comes out of it. It will be lots of discussions. Initial results will be shared at our February FSMA Fridays, but also will be published out there for general viewing. So I do highly encourage if you all could participate in that survey. We're very excited to be launching that. And then also I should just mention in regards to for more information, as I mentioned, recording link Monday, the survey, please do look out for that. In February, we'll talk about some of the initial survey results and continue the dialogue on some of these implementation challenges and guidance. And then whenever the final rules, last 2 rules come out, we're anticipating April. So hopefully April will be a good month to talk about food transportation rule. And then certainly there's always resources, more information about FSMA compliance and readiness and how TAG and both Safety Chain can help you on that, available on both our websites. So with that, I've promised everyone that I would try to be succinct in this FSMA Fridays to get everyone off to their day. A special call out to, I see a good few of Safety Chain's customers, Fresh Ventures, Fresher, good few others online with us today. Thanks as always to join, and just for the larger crowd. Really appreciate these interactive sessions, and we look forward to a very vibrant, we'll call it FSMA 2016. And thank you again, both Peyman and for Christopher, for joining us today.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Happy FSMA Fridays, everyone.